Greetings! Today in our video we're going to discuss a book of Graham Allison, Destined for War. Can America and China escape the Thucydides trap? To understand the meaning of this book, firstly we should deepen into the ancient times and get to know what a Thucydides trap is. In antiquity, Sparta was a blooming civilization, ruling power and had an authority. However, as far as we know, most of the things in our world have a tendency to change, and it concerned ancient times as well. In a nutshell, the rise of Athens was that dangerous and frightening for Sparta that they decided to unleash a war, trying to defeat the rising power before it could overpower the ruling one. Situations like that are now called a Thucydides trap. Graham Allison bases his argument on historical cases similar to Athens and Sparta's. There were 16 cases of the clash of ruling and rising powers, and 12 of them ended with war, which is quite a big number. However, Allison says and proves to us in his book that the Thucydides trap is, in fact, avoidable, at least nowadays. Further in our video, we will discuss the rise of China and these 16 cases.
So now we should move to another part, China. The main question is, what does President Xi Jinping want? In one line, to make China greater again. China's unbounded aspiration was driven by an indomitable determination to reclaim past greatness. Also, we can link Xi to Nelson Mandela, a person with enormous emotional stability who does not allow his personal misfortunes or sufferings to affect his judgment. What does mean making China greater again? There are 4 points. First is returning China to the predominance in Asia. The second one is the reestablishing control over the territories of Greater China. The third one is recovering its historic sphere of influence along its borders and in the adjacent seas. And the last one is commanding the respect of other greater powers in the councils of the world. Also, China's concept of international order mirrors its internal governments. China tended to think of their foreign relations as giving exceptions externally to the same principles of social and political order that were manifest internally. As a result, China's foreign relations were accordingly hierarchic and non-egalitarian. Just as it suppressed dissent and demanded that all its citizens bow to the power of central government, so did it expect regional powers to prostrate themselves before Beijing. Chinese civilization was profoundly ethno-ethnic and culturally supremacistic, seeing itself as the apex of all meaningful human activity. China had stood alone as Asia political, economical, and cultural hegemon, its periphery arrayed with a host of lesser states that embedded China's culture and paid tribute to China's greatness. Also, to understand China better, we should know some facts about Xi Jinping. His life was very difficult. He was born in the bristling of the revolution. He was son of the trusted colleague of Mao Zedong, who had fought alongside him in the Chinese Civil War. However, Mao had arrested father of Xi. Then, his school closed. Xi spent his days defending himself in street fights and stealing books from libraries to educate himself. He chose to survive by becoming redder than red and doing whatever it took to claw his way back up to the top. Also, Xi is aggressively mobilizing supporters to execute a hugely ambitious agenda of action, advising on 4 related fronts: revitalizing the party, cleansing up it from corruption, restoring its submission, and reestablishing its authority in the eyes of China's people. The second one is reviewing China's nationalism and patriotism to instill pride in being Chinese. The third one is engineering a third economic revolution, and the last one is the organizing and rebuilding China's military so that it can fight and win. Also, the interesting fact that Xi Jinping's 9 mayors is Mikhail Gorbachev. Shortly after taking power, Xi asked his colleagues a question: why did Soviet Union collapse? After careful analysis, Xi concluded that Gorbachev made 3 fatal errors. He relaxed political controls of society before he had reformed his country's economy. He and his predecessors allowed the Communist Party to become corrupt and ultimately hollow, and he nationalized the Soviet military, requiring commanders to swear allegiance to the nation, not to the party and its leader. As a result, this left the party disarmed. So now we're just moving to the last part, why war is not inevitable between the United States and America and China. Fortunately, escaping to the legal trap is not just a matter of theory. The past 500 years offer at least 4 cases in which rising and ruling powers successfully steered their ships of state through treacherous rulers without wars. Together, these cases offer a rich set of clues for leaders seeking to make the rise of China a 5th case of no war. The first clue is higher authorities can help resolve rivalry without war. For example, World War II statesmen wrestled with this aspiration in creating the United Nations. Its character established a framework of international law and organization overseen by a Security Council to which members are in theory subordinate. The second clue: states can embed it in larger economic, political, and security institutions that constrain historically normal behaviors. For example, Germany is the poster child of an economic and political giant that remains a military dwarf. It is economically integrated with its neighbors and protected by NATO. The third clue. Wily statesmen make a virtue of necessity and distinguish needs and wants. Brute facts are hard to ignore, as the US suppressed Britain in all important dimensions. Americans' determination to have their way become evident, far from diminishing its global structure or jeopardizing its security posture. Britain's shift of its fleet from the Western Hemisphere proved a timely rebalancing of its own forces before World War I. The fourth clue. Timing is crucial. Windows of opportunity open, often unexpectedly, only to close without warning. If British leaders had concluded in 1861 that a rising US continental hegemon would pose an intolerable threat to core British interests, then the smart option might have been intervene on behalf of the Confederacy in the American Civil War and reduce US power to manage proportions. The fifth clue. Cultural commonalities can help prevent conflict. Because Britain and the United States shared language and political culture, influential Britons could console themselves with the thought that although Britain was by most measures no longer number one, its values would remain dominant. The sixth clue. There is nothing new under the sun except nuclear weapons. Some observers claim in the 21st century is so different from the past that lessons from the previous experience are no longer relevant. The seventh clue. Math really does make all-out war madness. After exploiting the first bomb, the Soviet Union rapidly developed a nuclear arsenal. It's created that strategic recognizes mutual assured destruction. MID. The clue 8. Hot war between nuclear superpowers is thus no longer a justifiable option. The constraints imposed by MID on the contest between the Soviet Union and the United States are relevant for American strategists thinking about China today. The central implication for your strategy over China from the US-Soviet competition is therefore uncomfortable to accept it is impossible to deny. Once two states have inviolable nuclear arsenals, hot war is no longer a justifiable option. The clue number 9. Leaders of nuclear superpowers must nonetheless be prepared to risk a war they cannot win. The nuclear paradox is inescapable. In a competition constrained by MID, neither nation can win a nuclear war, but this is not the end of the matter. Paradoxically, each must demonstrate a willingness to risk losing such a war or finds itself knocked off the road. The 10th clue. Think economic interdependence raises the cost and thus lowers the likelihood of war. One party could not impose economic pain on other without harming itself. The 11th clue. Alliances can be a fatal attraction. Historically, such coalitions have sought to create a balance of power to maintain regional peace and security. But such alliances also create risk, since alliance ties run in both directions. Clue number 12. And the last one. Domestic performance is decisive. What nations do inside their borders matters at least as much as what they do abroad. Three factors could count most. Economic performance creates the substructure of national power. Competence in governments allows mobilization of resources for national purposes. And national lean or spirit sustainable both. In time, nations with stronger economies, more competent governments, and unified national support have greater impact on the choices and actions of others.
The first case from our case file is Portugal versus Spain. During the 15th century, Portugal was more developed than Spain and had more success in exploration and international trade. By the end of the 15th century, Spain got tired of constantly being overpowered by their neighbor and decided to challenge Portugal by claiming colonial superiority over Portugal. However, these two neighbors were helped to resolve their conflict by the Pope, who divided their colonized territories. At the end, they didn't go to war. Second case is France versus the Habsburgs. Long story short, in the 16th century, the rise of Spanish House of Habsburg threatened France's authority and power. Desperately trying to maintain their dominance and influence over Western Europe, France started a series of wars for 40 years. Both sides took a break when they exhausted the resources from war, and then France claimed its dominance in Europe once again. Third case is the Habsburgs versus Ottoman Empire. Although a series of wars between the Spanish Habsburgs and France were over, the fight for dominance continued, but now between the Habsburgs and Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Empire was rising quickly and spreading its influence over Europe and also wanting to expand into Eastern Europe. Once more, the Habsburgs fell into the Thucydides trap and suffered a series of wars against the Ottoman Empire for the power over Europe. The fourth case is also dedicated to the Habsburgs. We're not that far into the history yet, but I already feel like humanity's a joke. Basically, the rise of Lutheran North and Lutheran rebellion threatened the power of Holy Roman Empire, which resulted in the 30 Years' War. Fifth case is about Dutch Republic in England. Dutch Republic was a ruling power in the 17th century, but its dominance in the water area and rising colonial empire provoked a conflict between the ruling power and the rising power, which was England at that time. Anglo-Dutch wars resulted in strengthening the Dutch Republic's dominance. However, sixth case is devoted to France and Great Britain. France's authority was once again questioned and challenged, but this time by Great Britain. This conflict continued for 80 years, starting numerous wars such as the 9 Years' War, War of Spanish Succession, War of the Austrian Succession, and the final 7 Years' War. At the end, Great Britain overpowered France and became the ruling power, rearranging the balance of power in North America and Europe. Seventh case. Once again, in history, Great Britain and France fought for dominance in Europe. At this point, I'm already sick of these endless wars. French Revolution improved their military machine, and under the rule of Napoleon, France became a menace to the ruling power of Great Britain. Britain's smart strategy and fights at sea helped them to avoid the invasion of France. Last but not least, for my part, a conflict between France and United Kingdom versus Russia. In the 19th century, France and UK united against the rapidly growing and rising power of Russia, who instilled fear in European community. The dispute escalated into the Crimean War, and at the end, technical and organizational backwardness of Russia resulted in its defeat. France's and Great Britain's victory boosted their dominance and authority in Europe, strengthening their ruling power.
So now we're just moving to the last part of the Thucydides trap case file. The ninth case is France versus Germany, as the ruling power of France and the rising power of Germany. Prussia put France in the most dangerous of all moods, that of the greater power which sees itself declining to the second rank. Thanks to the Prussian use of a universal conscription, an army 1/3 larger than France, ending this with the Franco-Prussian War. The 10th case is China and Russia versus Japan, as the ruling powers, of course, China and Russia, and the rising power, Japan. There are two outcomes: is first Sino-Japanese War and Russia-Japanese War. Rapid economic growth and military advances facilitated Japanese rise in the late 19th century. Japan's increasing power hinted its leadership resentment towards its subordinate position in the region, comparing to the Western powers and China, encouraging a sense of urgency that they must act more intelligently to extend Japanese influence. The 11th case is United Kingdom versus United States. Ruling power is United Kingdom and the rising power is United States. This case has outcomes with no war. In the last 3 decades of the 19th century, the United States had risen from the ashes of its civil war to become an economic colossus. Rapidly developing the United States tripled British levels of energy consumption and iron and steel production, all key measures of industrialization. The 12th case is the United Kingdom versus Germany. Ruling power was United Kingdom by support of France and Russia, and the rising power was Germany. This ended with the World War I, so we know all the facts. The 13th case is Soviet Union, France, and United Kingdom versus Germany. As we already understand, outcome of this case was World War II. And the last case is United States versus Japan. The ruling power, of course, was United States, and the rising power was Japan. In 1915, Japanese Prime Minister used his country's new fund against the Republic of China for greater Japanese economic and territorial authority of Asia Pacific. As United States helps China, they conquer 4 dependent territories. This campaign extended into the heart of China. In the next few years, however, the US began to step up aid to China and imposed increasingly severe economic sanctions against China. Since the island nation depended almost totally on imports of critical raw material from the United States, Japanese leadership viewed this continental as mortal threat and ended with the World War II, but on the other side.
However, by discussing these cases in his book, Graham Allison also shows us what we should not do and how we should avoid wars. And after reading this book, I think I have hope that humanity will someday learn on our mistakes, and wars will stop. And we will live in peace again. So, yes.